Hello. I'm going to have to assume that you can hear me. Sorry? Yes. Okay. So, good afternoon. It's Trevor Hancock, and I'm here in Victoria, British Columbia, on the west coast of Canada. And it's a pleasure for me to be able to talk with you this afternoon, and to talk in particular about healthy cities. And I don't know what introduction, if any, you had for these, but I was one of the people who, almost 30 years ago now, started to develop this idea of healthy cities, which has now become a project around the world. What I want to do today is talk about governance and planning in the healthy city approach, and how healthy cities relate both to local government and the process of governance, and also how it relates to urban planning. And it looks as though I don't have control of the slides now, so could someone give me the next slide, please? And click one more time. So the question is, what is the purpose of government? And I would argue that the purpose of government is in fact to maximize the health and well-being and the quality of life of all the people. And if I can have the next part of this slide, click one more time. And that has to happen within the limits of local, regional, and global ecosystems. So this is a little different from what I sometimes think governments think their business is, which is to grow the economy and to be focused on the economy. And I would argue that that is the wrong focus for government. So I could have the next slide. And what we need is what is called human-centered development. People of the real wealth of nations set the human development force many years ago now. And so we need to stop thinking about development simply in economic terms, and to think about development in terms of people and in terms of human-centered. Again, the next slide. Now, this is not a new idea. This is the masthead, that is to say, the slogan above the front page of a journal called The Sanitarium, which was published by Sir Benjamin Ward Richardson. He was a leader of public health in the 19th century in England, in Victorian England. And the slogan at the top of every edition said, "The nation's health is the nation's wealth." So this is an idea that's been around for at least 150 years, and really in many ways it's a lot older than that. If I can have the next slide, next bit, thank you. Now, some years ago, Bill Clinton very famously said that it's the economy that's stupid, and my response to that is, it's the people that's stupid. We really do need to shift the focus from the economy to the people, but the economy is supposed to be healthy. Next slide. So, if our focus is or should be human development and human flourishing, maximum potential of human beings, what can cities do to support that? Well, the first is to recognize that the most important asset that a city has is its population, and that a healthy, a flourishing population is the most important asset a city possesses. That means that we need to put development of human potential at the center of urban government. So we need to say that our purpose as a government and our purpose in the government process in cities is to maximize human development and human potential. And we need to recognize that this calls for a collective effort. It takes, well, there's a famous phrase that says it takes a whole village to raise a child. I would say it takes a whole city to raise healthy people. Next slide. So then the question, if we take that from governance more specifically to urban planning, is what is the purpose of urban planning? And when I first started talking about this, 30 years ago in the city of Toronto, and I talked with our Department of Planning, of Urban Planners, and I talked with senior planners there, and said, what is the purpose of planning? In a sense, they didn't really have a purpose, or at least they couldn't state it. They talked about basically having the right building go up in the right place for the right height and the right style. But what they were not thinking about was, what is it for? Are we simply planning so the department can meet its goals? Are we planning for the economy so that it can grow? Are we planning for the councillors so that they can be re-elected? Or are we planning for other reasons? The next slide. And of course, I would argue that the outcome of good urban planning is health and well-being, is quality of life, that it be safe and attractive and livable and lively. Next slide. And so when Lenzel and I, back in 1986, wrote the background paper for the World Health Organization's Healthy Cities project, we gave a definition, which is the one you see here, and I'll read it. A healthy city is one that is continually creating and improving those physical and social environments and expanding those community resources, which enable people to mutually support each other in performing all the functions of life and in developing their national potential. So in this definition there are many important things, but perhaps the most important thing is that we're talking about a healthy city, and we're talking about health in very big terms. We're talking about people achieving their maximum potential. So it's much broader than health in the narrow sense of a long life expectancy and low blood pressure and not being obese and being fit and brushing your teeth and so on. This is about human potential. Secondly, we said that this is one that's continually doing this. A healthy city isn't a city that decides it's already healthy but can stop doing things to improve health. You never stop doing this. Thirdly, it's about physical and social environment. Fourthly, it's about community resources. Fifthly, it's about mutual support. So we recognize this as a collective effort that deals with environmental and social and economic and other conditions. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit more about these ideas of human development and human potential. Next slide. So, following up on the notion of the Human Development Report, in 1986, the same time incidentally as we did our report on healthy cities, the UN General Assembly, in a declaration on the right to development, says very clearly and very simply for us that the human person is the central subject of development. That's where my focus is, perhaps in part because I was trained as a physician, and so my focus is on human well-being. Next slide. So again, you will see some overlap here. So the UN Human Development Report has said that human development is about creating an environment in which people can develop their full potential and lead productive, creative lives in accordance with their needs and interests. That is very much like the definition for healthy cities that I just discussed with you. If we go to the next slide, you will see here, also in 1986 was obviously a very good year. Also in 1986, a very important World Health Organization document that was created as an international conference in Ottawa, in Canada, which I was one of the participants in the conference. And it's Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion. One of the things that it did was to identify a set of basic requirements for health. And those are peace, food, shelter, education, income, stable ecosystems, sustainable resources, and I would add specifically clean water and air, which exists within the notion of sustainable resources, and then social justice and equity. Next slide. So then the question is, how can the city ensure that this happens with all of these basic prerequisites, food, shelter, education, and income? How can the city ensure, or perhaps help to ensure, that this happens? And that it happens incidentally for everyone. It isn't just peace and food and shelter and education and income for some people. It has to be for everyone. Next slide. So here I want to discuss a little bit more this notion of human potential. Human capabilities in the Human Development Report have been defined as a range of things that people can do or be in life. And the most basic capabilities of human development, let's say, are to be what can be long and healthy lives, which is obviously what those that are working in public health are interested in, to be knowledgeable, which of course is the educational sector, to have access to the resources needed for a decent standard of living, so that's been through the economic development end of things, and to be able to participate in the life of the community, which is a topic I will come back to, because it's very important in terms of the health of business. But again, that's the participation in the life of the community. Next slide. So here is a definition for human potential from the Center for Human Potential and Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Note that they define human potential as motivation, human intelligence, social and emotional development, ethics and morality, and a sense of civic responsibility. So combine that with some of the other ideas around health and well-being. Also, I would add a capacity to be creative and innovative, a sense of empathy and caring for others. Those are what, to me, constitute human potential and what a well-functioning human being would be. Next one. So again, I want to stress the point I made earlier, which is that all of this has to happen within the limits of the ecosystem of the Earth on which we live. We only have one Earth, and we are, I'm not going to go into this in depth, that's a whole other speech, but we are exceeding the capacity of the Earth to provide for us, and that has huge long-term implications for health, for cities, for society, and indeed for our whole civilization. So human development and human and ecosystems, says the Institute World Resources Institute in their report 15, 14 years ago now, in every respect, human development and human security are closely linked to the productivity of our ecosystems. Our future rests squarely upon their continued viability. So a very clear statement that human development, which is what I've been focusing on, it rests squarely on the continued viability of ecosystems. Next slide. So human development, this is from a Canadian Public Health Association report, more than 20 years old now. I was a member of this task force. And in that task force, we said that we gave a definition of sustainable human development. And we said that human development and the achievement of human potential requires a form of economic activity that is environmentally and socially sustainable in this and future generations. Now, The point of this definition is that, first of all, it's not about economic development. It sees economic activity as a means to achieve human development. But the purpose is not economic development. The purpose is human development. Economic activity, if it is environmentally and socially sustainable in the long term, can contribute to human development. So next slide. One way to put this quite simply is that we need to grow the people rather than grow the economy. We have a tendency to think that what we have to do is to grow the economy. Well, no, that's not really our focus, and particularly not our focus in the world of health. Well, I don't know what that was, but I hope you can still hear me. So we need to grow the people, not the economy. And Jim Rouse, who was an American urban developer who developed a community back in the 1950s called Colombia, Maryland, I think he put it beautifully. Len Doole told me this story because he worked with him. But Jim Rouse said to his development team, I want you to build me a garden to grow people in. Now, if you want an image of what a healthy city is or should be, I would say that's a very good image to keep in your mind. How would your city be if it was a garden to grow people in? What would that mean? What would it look like? Next slide. So I mentioned earlier that this has begun for everyone, for all. And I'm going to very quickly talk through a few slides about urban health equity. Next slide. Equity meaning equal opportunity, meaning that if there is inequality, it is not severe, it is not considered unfair or unjust. So in the world that I work in, we refer to this as health equity, having reasonably equal and certainly good levels of health, and not having large inequalities in health. The WHO, the World Health Organization, Commission on Civil Determinants of Health 6 years ago now, said in its executive summary, very simply, social injustice is killing people on a grand scale. And that, of course, is happening in our cities as well as out in the country and in the nation as a whole. And here is an important idea from a French philosopher called Raymond Aron, who says that when inequality becomes too great, the idea of community becomes impossible. And that's a very important idea, because when we are so separated from other people in our community by a huge gap in income, in education, in political and social power, then we do not feel part of the community there. We exclude them from our community. And so the idea of a total community becomes impossible. So inequality, both in health and more broadly social injustice, is a major threat to the well-being of cities. And I was actually part of a global research network which looked at this recently, coming out of that WHO Commission. So the next slide, the next 4 slides, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these. These are also slides that specifically illustrate for high-income countries. But the point here is very simple, and this applies or would apply in cities as much as it would apply in a country. On the left up there, you have a scale, an index of health and social problems, and it runs from better to worse. And the index includes things like life expectancy, mass and disability, infant mortality, homicide, imprisonment, teenage birth, trust, obesity, mental illness, and social mobility. So this is a single index that combines all of those. And then along the bottom you have the level of income inequality from low to high. This and the next 3 slides come from the work of Wilkinson and Pickett of very important book in 2009 called Spirit Level, and you can find this information at the website that's shown there, the Quality Trust. But the point is very simple, which is the higher the inequality, and you will notice that the USA is actually off the line up on the right there. But the higher the inequality, the worse the index of health and social problems. So more equal countries have better health, or they have fewer health and social problems. Next slide. The next slide says that these health and social problems are not related to average income. You can see here we do not have that same linear relationship when you look at national income per person along the bottom as opposed to inequality. I'm not sure you can see any real pattern there. It's a cluster of things. So next slide. So it's not about average income, it's about equality. Here's another example where here we have, again on the bottom, income inequality from low to high, going from left to right. And then we have the index of child well-being from UNICEF. And the lower the inequality, the better the child well-being index. Again, you can see the US, but also the UK, with high levels of inequality and very poor performance on the child well-being index. Now, this is for rich countries, but there is no reason to believe that it's not true in countries in general, and also that there's evidence that it is true in all countries, and also not just in the country, but in the cities. And the final slide is just shows the same thing essentially. Next slide. The next thing, the next point is the same one, which is in this case for mental illness. That the greater the income inequality on the right, the worse the level of mental illness. And you can see the line there linking that. So, next slide. So the research network that I was part of concluded that urban development that places health equity as a central policy goal will improve health, reduce social inequity, and support communities to cope with and divert further global environmental change. So we were linking urban development and health equity, recognizing that if you reduce inequalities in health, if you get rid of those terrible inequalities that we know exist between rich and poor, or at least you minimize them, then you will not only improve health, but you will reduce a number of other social measures, and it also enables people to cope with global environmental change, because those who are living in poverty and in the worst housing and in the worst land are also much more vulnerable to global environmental change. Next slide. So if we take this into the realm of urban planning, how can urban planning facilitate things like access to shelter and basic services, access to work and amenities, access to physical activity, food security, safe living environments, access to a healthy natural environment, having good mental health, having mobility for people with disabilities, for children, for seniors, the people that we usually reach out with our transport planning, for example, and also access to effective healthcare. So how can urban planning make all of those things possible, all of those things better? Because that will reduce inequalities in health, it will reduce the levels of social inequality and social injustice. And your whole city will benefit from that. So one of the things you have to understand is that you need to invest in reducing inequalities in health. And the investment will pay off in the way that some of those other slides earlier showed. Fewer health and social problems, less crime for that matter, better child well-being, less mental illness and so on. So let me then move on and talk very specifically, next slide, about local government and health. Next slide. Good, thank you. So what determines the well-being of the population? One of the most important things we have to understand is it is not primarily the healthcare system that determines the health of the population. This has become a huge myth in modern society, that somehow the healthcare system gives us health. It's actually not really the healthcare system, if you think about it. It's an illness care system. It's designed to care for people who have illness or injury. But most of the determinants of health, which is the next word, lie beyond healthcare. And I organized a conference 30 years ago now. It was one of the first conferences to start to explore this idea. That housing policy, or transportation policy, or urban planning policy, or education policy, these policies are much more important for the health of the population than the health of the policies of the Ministry of Health. So as that first one said, the most important policies for health lie outside the Ministry of Health. The Ministry of Health policies will not give us better health, or only they will contribute in a small way, perhaps 10 or 15%, but not much more. What is important is local living and working conditions. Next slide. Now this is again not a new idea. We need to recognize how much health has been a factor in the growth of local government. And I had a graduate student there in Seville back in the 1980s, and he went and looked at municipal departments in Toronto, since Toronto became a city in 1834. And at that time, 150 years later, he found, if he went back and looked in the archives, that 16 of 36 civil services, so almost half, were found to have health concerns as contributors to their establishment and growth. So the public works department, an important reason for a public works department was to provide clean water and sanitation. For a fire department, it was to protect people from death and injury from fire. The police department also actually has health as a purpose, and not just creating safety. Obviously, the housing department, by ensuring the quality of housing, building codes, when you look at them, most building codes are about health and safety. And then we found another 10 of them, in fact, the 10 of those 16, health has been a major impact on the growth of the city department. So again, if you go back and look at history, you find that health has been a central concern of city government and city planning for a long time. Next slide. So here are some ways we should be very familiar to of how local government can improve health. I've already mentioned public works provides sanitation and clean water. The housing department provides shelter. The parks department provides recreation and nature and protection of the natural environment. The education department provides knowledge and skills. The transportation department provides mobility and safety. And also, incidentally, public transportation is a much healthier form of transportation than private cars. The police and fire department provide safety. The social services department provides support. Public health provides protection and prevention. Health services provide treatment and care. And you can add your own municipal departments, and you probably should do this if you have not already done so as an exercise, to think about how this particular department works to improve health. And what we need then to do is to make that an explicit purpose rather than something that's implicit, that's hidden in the work of the department. Next slide. If we look more specifically at the built environment, some of the things that contribute to health in the built environment are that we create safe built environments, whether it's safe housing that doesn't fall down, or safe roads where people don't get killed, that it's clean, that we have good sanitation and healthy housing, that it's green, that we have access to nature and recreation and fresh air, that it's active. When we talk about active commuting or active cities, they have to be walkable, bikeable, we have to be able to get around them. That urban planning and urban design has a very big role in deciding that. They should be age-friendly. So, are there slower traffic lights? In Victoria, where I live, where we have a large elderly population, the traffic lights are fairly slow because older people take longer to cross the road. Things like curb cuts to allow people who have mobility problems to go up and down on pavements. Are your environments child-friendly? UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, has a whole program on child-friendly cities. Some of you may be involved in that. And it needs to be livable. It needs to be an attractive and lively place to be. So there's a variety of ways in which the built environment determines our health. Next slide. So I've now got 3 or 4 slides to talk very specifically about the report I mentioned earlier, which is the WHO Commission on the Social Determinants of Health. And that commission has 3 key recommendations. And the first of those is one which speaks very directly to citizens, improve daily living conditions. That was one of their 3 key recommendations. Improve the conditions, the circumstances in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. Their second recommendation also does apply to cities, and that is to tackle the inequitable distribution of power, money, and resources. And you know perfectly well that in your city, as in the city here in Canada, there is an inequitable distribution of power, money, and resources. And that translates into inequalities in health. And thirdly, and really importantly, we do need to measure and understand the problem and assess the impact of action. So we have to do surveillance and assessment and monitoring of the things that we do. Next slide. So under the heading of improving daily living conditions, one of their key recommendations was this one: place health and health equity at the heart of urban governance and planning. That is to say, manage urban development to ensure a greater availability of affordable housing, invest in urban slum upgrading, and ensure urban planning promotes healthy and safe behaviour equitably. Again, that word equity. So place health and health equity at the heart of urban governance. That is what I started with, which is the notion of human-centered development, of focusing on people and focusing on all the people and getting some level of equity. Next slide. In order to do that, the WHO Commission says we have to empower all groups in society through fair representation, and we have to enable civil society to organise and act. One of the greatest assets we have, if we use it well, is the power of the people in their community and the power of the organizations that people create. And those organizations can be powerful in opposition to what we want to do, or if you work with them, they can be powerful in supporting and directing, in fact, what needs to be done. Because people who live in poverty usually have a very good idea of what it would take to make their lives better. And it's not just money, and they know that. So next slide. I want for a moment to talk about this notion that I have touched on a couple of times of governance. And governance is more than government. And the United Nations organization Habitat in 2002 said that governance is the sum of the many ways individuals and institutions, public and private, plan and manage the common affairs of the city. And as with also definitions, there are many elements in here. So first of all, it involves individuals as well as institutions. So it's not just about institutions and organizations, but individuals. Secondly, it involves not just the public realm, but the private realm. So how do you work with the private sector? And thirdly, although I didn't make a bullet on this one, it's about the common affairs of the city, planning and managing the common affairs. So what is our shared vision of what a healthy city would be? How do you work with your community to develop a shared vision? A shared vision can be very, very powerful. Next slide. So the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, in its report, recognized the need for new models of governance. It wrote that in terms of healthy, what we now start to call healthy urban governance. Urban governance focused on health. In cities, they wrote, new models of governance are required to plan cities and design, and then they go to talk about a number of ways that cities are designed. So they recognize the new models of governance. So what are some of those new models and what's involved? Next slide. Here are some key principles of healthy urban governance. We identified these quite early on in the process of developing the European Healthy City project in the 1980s. And I think that we included them in a report we did in about 1990. So here they are. First of all, political commitment. You have to have a mayor, council, political leadership who are committed to making their city more healthy, to putting health at the centre, putting human development at the centre. Secondly, you have to have community engagement. You cannot shut the community out. You need to have the community engaged. And that means at a very local level, and that means all sectors of the community, not just powerful, well-educated, wealthy members of the community. Thirdly, you have to have what is called intersectoral action. You have to bring together all of the different sectors of society, and those sectors include the public sector, the private sector, the community sector, the academic sector, the faith sector, the churches or other religious organizations, and so on. There's a number of different sectors in society that need to be brought together to act together, which is why a common vision is so important. And then you need healthy public policy. And I touched on this earlier. What would a healthy housing policy look like? What would a healthy transportation policy look like? What would a healthy education policy look like? An education policy, part of the purpose of which is to maximize health. I'm not saying that any of these policy areas should be focused only on health, but definitely when you have a transportation policy, we should understand the health impact and we should design it to be good for health and not to be bad for health. And then you need new forms of urban democratic governance doing this. Community engagement in the 21st century is nothing like community engagement in the 19th or 20th century. So we have to rethink how we do something. Next slide. So here's a couple of examples. When I was in Brazil, in Belo Horizonte, for the International Conference on Urban Health about 3 or 4 years ago, I learned that they have a senior member of the city government, a municipal deputy secretary, who is responsible for democratic governance. Now that struck me as such a very simple and very important idea. Surely democratic governance is or should be an important focus for any city. And so my question is, why doesn't every municipality in the world have something equivalent to a municipal deputy secretary of democratic governance? It's a hugely important issue, and yet it's one that cities, and not just cities, but national and provincial and state governments do not pay enough attention to. A second example, which again very common in Brazil and then from Porto Alegre, where it started spreading out around the world, is participatory budgeting. Instead of me talking Brazil, I should have just have said at the beginning, congratulations to the Colombian football side, because it's like they're having a great World Cup, and I'm following that with great interest. Anyway, yeah, that's my side. Participatory budgeting. Thirdly, there's a new idea out there called crowdsourcing, using the internet. So Iceland, for example, used the internet to solicit input into its new constitution. Finland is using the internet to create new laws. How will cities use the internet to engage people and to develop new forms of government that work for the 21st century? Next slide. So you might say, well, why should local governments do it? Well, I would say, first of all, it's because they are where most people live. And in fact, they are the closest level of government to people. So the decisions that they make are very important in the lives of citizens, and in some ways more important than the decisions that national governments make, certainly in some areas. Thirdly, they are concerned with the quality of life of their citizens. I was struck some years ago by realizing that that while national governments tend to focus on GDP, gross domestic product, to measure their progress, and the same is true in Canada for provincial governments, that is not the case for cities. I do not know any city that measures its progress in terms of GDP. They tend to focus on measuring quality of life, and certainly here in Canada, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, for 20 years, has been developing the quality of life management system. So local governments influence many of the determinants of health. Next slide. So this requires some of the things I've already talked about. Back up one. Yes. So why may they do it best? Well, one reason is that politicians and public servants actually live in the communities that they serve. So here in Canada we have a problem, for example, when people who live in the capital, in Ottawa, 3,000 miles from where I'm sitting, make decisions about my life. They don't live here, they don't understand my life, they don't understand what's going on in Victoria. And so they shouldn't be making those decisions. Local politicians, local public servants live in the communities that they serve. Their decisions very directly affect themselves, their families, their friends. They are stakeholders in these decisions. They're very connected with the local networks, and they hear and engage in local discussions. So they're in a position to do it best at a local level. And also because the policy-making apparatus is more intimate at the local level. So in Toronto, it's not that difficult for me, in even a very big city, to know the planning department, to know the public works people, to know the housing people. At a national level, that's much less common. So the policy-making apparatus is more intimate. Next slide. Municipal governments also, as I said, they focus on the quality of life rather than on GDP. I've already said this, so next slide. So for this to happen, I've already touched on this, requires a vision. And my friend Clem himself, who founded the Institute for Alternative Futures in Washington, D.C., he said years ago, and I've always liked this, the vision is values projected into the future. I think that's a very important statement. So what we need to do is to understand our values, be clear about what our values are, and in this case, what are our values collectively as a city or a town. And then, if we live those values, what does it look like? And that becomes our vision. It needs a conceptual model. We need to understand how all these different pieces fit together. And it needs a set of mechanisms and structures to do it. And the next slide talks about what some of those mechanisms and structures might be. Next slide. Next slide, thank you. And again, next button. So the next cut button, just push the button till the end of the slide. Thank you. So it needs political commitment, as I've already said. These are the same things that we talked about earlier. So what does that look like? Well, it has to be led by the mayor and council. They have to be committed to developing and implementing healthy public policy. Community engagement, that means you need things like local participatory councils that can advise council that in the process of participatory budgeting may have control over some part of the budget. You then need intersectional action both within the city board. So you need a technical group that brings together experts from housing and public works, from parks and planning and transportation and public health and education and so on. A technical group to sort of manage this process within the city board, within the city government. And then beyond city government, you need a leadership group which needs to be led by the mayor to bring together key civic leaders from the public sector, the private sector, the community sector, the faith sector, the academic sector. So that's the two mechanisms. So you need a working group, a technical working group within government, and you need a multi-sectional leadership group beyond government. And then you need some key structures such as the leadership council I just talked about, but also a health city office within the city hall that can provide technical support. Now, I am going to move quickly through a few slides here, because what I have done here is provide some resources. So next slide. I just want to point you to some resources, and there's a website mentioned there. This is an example here in British Columbia of an initiative, a guide produced for elected officials and senior staff, very recent, in fact it's just presented today at a conference I was at. And it's called Plan H. H stands for health, so I guess in Colombia it would be Plan S for saludables, or saludables. Sorry, my Spanish is not saludables. It's anyway. So next slide. Plan H was designed, I'm not going to spend time on these slides, I just want to show you what's in there. Plan H was designed to support local government engagement and partnership. So it's a set of resources. Next slide. So this is one of the key documents, which is how the local government improve health and community well-being. So you might want to think about as a group of cities and as a national project to create healthy cities. What are some of the resources such as this? Maybe you could take a resource like this if you don't already have one and translate it and then make it culturally appropriate for Colombia. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, but also you can't just translate it. It talks about how local governments improve health in Canada, which is a different set of political structure. But there's certainly resources out there, and that's really all we're trying to point to. There are resources to help. Similarly, the next slide. This is from something also in British Columbia called the Healthy Built Environment Alliance. And they developed a set of indicators of 10 best practices where there's evidence of linkage between a planning practice and better health. And so you can see some of those here and in the next slide. So there are things such as increasing density and land use, increasing connectivity, increasing public transit, increasing recreational facilities, zoning to improve food access. That's the first slide. Next slide. Here we have healthy built environment indicators, the next step. Increased affordable housing. And under that you see a whole list of potential indicators that can be used to measure progress. And the same for the other factors here: better safety and environmental design, child-friendly, age-friendly, improved public infrastructure. So maybe again you need to develop, if you're going to monitor progress, you need to know what to measure. Next, and I'm going to wrap this up in the next couple of minutes. This is, so having talked about what governments can do, let me talk for a moment more specifically about what peoples can do. So if we talk about planning, so if we talk about people-centered urban planning, next slide. I must say I was very impressed. I've been now twice in Medellin, and I was very impressed by their city plan guidelines and their notion of social urbanism. And I know there are similar activities underway in other cities in Colombia and around Latin America. But I thought this was really an important idea, and I'll just go over the bit highlighted in red. So the city plan guidelines in Medellin from 10 years ago, 12 years ago now, say the indicators of student development and quality of life are public investment. So they understand it's about student development, about quality of life, it's human-centered or people-centered planning. The third bullet there, urban projects must simultaneously integrate physical, cultural, and social components. So understanding the importance of linking those. Next one. The transport system must be used as an organizing access of mobility, but really importantly, they see in red there, education and culture as priorities to guide programs and projects. So when you start to say it's not the economy that it's focused, but education, culture, and human development, and quality of life and focus, then you completely change the way you do things. In the next slide, which is of course a picture that will be very familiar to many of you of the aerial tramway and the library at Parque España, where I visited about a year ago now. But very impressive. When you take those ideas and translate them into practice, so you have the Metro Biblio, where you have libraries in the metro, and where you teach civic politeness in the metro, in the way that people line up to get on the cable cars and so on. So very interesting ideas of linking education and culture with physical infrastructure. And I'm just going to leave you, next slide, with, I'm not going to go through the next set of slides. There are, if you get a hold of this, about 4 or 5 more slides. But they all are summaries of resources that are available in something called the Healthy Built Environment Alliance. And you can go online, there's a website listed there, and you can find these resources. So if we go to the next slide, for example, you will find there an introduction to land use planning for health professionals. So you need to explain urban planning to health professionals. But then on the right side, you see Health 201. That is the opposite. That is the framework to explain health to urban planners. So urban planners need to learn about health, and health people need to learn about urban planning. Next slide. This shows something called our Healthy Built Environment Institute. And there's a set of evidence. This document contains a summary of the evidence that links urban planning with health. I think you'll find it very useful. Next slide. It covers linkages between neighborhood design and health, transportation and health, natural environment and health, food systems and health, and housing and health, and has evidence-based guidelines. So, again, you wouldn't want to just pick these up and translate them, but if you don't have anything like this, you can get a leg up, you can get an advantage by drawing on the sort of resources. And this is just in our province in Canada. There are many other examples around the world of these sorts of resources. So if you don't have them already, I just wanted to point them to them as examples of the sort of tools and resources you will need nationally to create healthy cities. And with that, I will stop, and I have about 20 minutes before I need to leave. If you have questions. Thank you.
Buenas tardes. Disponemos entonces por el tiempo del profesor Janko, de 20 minutos para hacer preguntas, quienes quieran hacerlas libremente, pero de manera muy concreta. Vamos entonces a proceder, quienes quieran hacerle preguntas o a partir de lo que escucharon o de las inquietudes que se han suscitado en estos 2 días que puedan o pudiesen ser complementadas con lo que él nos ha compartido. Primera pregunta, ¿quién se lanza? Supongo que están pensando en la pregunta muy concreta. Segunda pregunta. Primera pregunta. Adelante. Miren que ha hecho un ejercicio muy interesante tratando de integrar, tratando de mostrarnos cómo cerrar esa brecha entre la planeación urbana y la salud urbana. Y cuáles pueden ser esas claves para poder avanzar en el sentido del mismo del objetivo del taller. No sé, sin temor a entender que podamos tener muchas preguntas, pero como el camino es bastante complejo, pues nos limite a tener una dificultad para elaborar las preguntas, pero valdría la pena aprovechar la experticia del profe Janko, dado que fue quien construyó el concepto hace más de 30 años.
Yes, I can hear you.
Por favor, nombre, municipio y si viene de salud, planeación y la pregunta.
Mi nombre es Laura Moreno, vengo de la Secretaría de Planeación de Bucaramanga. Hay unos elementos que se presentan muy repetitivos en la presentación y que hacen referencia como unas condiciones previas para poder llegar a ese concepto de ciudad saludable. Tienen que ver con la equidad, con la justicia social, con la participación de las organizaciones y con el trabajo o la acción intersectorial. Desde la experiencia nuestra y las realidades en los municipios, pues tenemos como 2 elementos de esos también que tienen un gran peso y que es todo el tema de la inequidad y de la justicia social. Incluso en términos de indicadores, el indicador de Gini, que habla de inequidad, para la mayoría de los municipios de Bucaramanga está por encima del 0.5%, y eso ya de hecho presenta una dificultad. Quisiera saber, desde las experiencias que han tenido, cómo trabajar en esos elementos que son estructurales y que a veces son los que más inciden para que efectivamente podamos hacer una planeación, una planificación con miras a lograr una ciudad saludable.
Bueno, Trevor, adelante mientras vamos pensando en la siguiente pregunta.
Okay. If I understood the question correctly, part of the problem is that inequality, social injustice doesn't just come from the city level, it comes from structural conditions nationally and even internationally. And I agree that is true. And so the question then becomes, what is within the power and capacity of the city, but the whole city, not just city government. So what can the private sector do to reduce poverty? And of course, it's not always a popular idea that the private sector play a role in this, but obviously one part of what they can do is to pay what's called a living wage. And some private sector organizations in Canada now are beginning to recognize that it's actually in their interest to pay employees better. And of course, that was the great realization of Henry Ford back in the days when he was building the first cars, mass-produced cars, which is that if he didn't pay his employees well enough, they wouldn't be able to afford what he was making, and so he wouldn't have anywhere to sell them. That was an important insight. Then there are things such as we see in Cali, where I'm going to be in Cali in October, but I've heard for years about the work of the Carvajal Foundation in supporting local people in things like business development, in understanding how to do simple business management for their corner store, for their business, helping them with those sorts of skills. So there are things the private sector can do, things the public sector can do, things that the non-profit sector can do. Simply creating opportunities for work. If you are having to do upgrading, for example, there was an example in Liverpool I saw many years ago now, where they were doing energy upgrades to the public housing that they had, social housing. But they didn't bring in outside contractors. They hired local people and they used it as an opportunity to teach them the skills and enable them to then go on to develop their own local businesses. So thinking about how you use that's the people you have right there. So those are some of the ways that I hope that's helpful to you.
Nos está animando el público. Ya tenemos 3 manos alzadas para hacer 3 preguntas. Adelante.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Esperanza Lara, soy consultora del Ministerio de Salud y Protección Social. Quisiera preguntar sobre el desarrollo de lo saludable en ciertos microentornos. A lo largo de los años nosotros hemos venido trabajando estrategias como las de escuelas promotoras de la salud y avanzando en otros ambientes como las organizaciones laborales, como las universidades saludables. Entonces quisiera preguntarle cuál es, digamos, la experiencia de conectar este desarrollo de microentornos con el de ciudad y en términos también de indicadores, ¿qué nos puede decir de lo que uno puede lograr desarrollando microentornos saludables y conectar ese desarrollo al de las ciudades?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. One of the ways that I talk about healthy cities is that you build a healthy city one household at a time, one street at a time, one block at a time, one neighborhood at a time. So it needs to be both a top-down process in the sense of the political engagement and commitment, and not just political, but civic leadership, which is the sort of top-down piece, and also bottom-up. And that also goes for building it. So you have to have healthy homes. One way to understand healthy city is that a healthy city consists of healthy homes, healthy schools, healthy workplaces, healthy hospitals, healthy prisons. There's an interesting one to think about, healthy prisons, healthy neighborhoods, and so on, healthy markets. So using the micro level or the lower level, the sort of more community-based changes or settings that we were talking about are the things that make a city. And so it has to be a combination of that bottom-up work, starting right at making healthy households. And so a key indicator of the health of the city is the quality of its houses, is the air